Hi everyone, Pooka here with a surprise minisode for Highsummer. This script is actually over 5,000 words, so maybe it won't be a minisode exactly, but in any case, this will be a solo endeavor on my part, a single mic excursion into the remaining items of old edition Changeling fiction that we haven't yet gotten to. It's been my summer project to track down and read these texts as they are long out of print and unavailable in PDF, so this will be my little gift to tide you over until we return from summer hiatus in early August. One brief announcement, friend of the show Fetch has created a game. Titled The Necromancer, it's about, and I quote, trans paladins battling against an opponent who wields dysphoria and transphobia as tools. It was created in 2 days as part of this month's Queer Wrath Game Jam, and is also submitted to the Trans Fury Jam, both of which are linked in the show notes to this episode. It looks to be an intriguing bit of gaming, and we do try to give shouts out to the creators in our midst. You can find out more about all of the above at our Discord digital freehold at www.discord.me/ctp, and you're always welcome to just come by and hang out and chat with us there. Alright, all that being announced, let's cue up the theme music and dive in. This is Changeling the Podcast. In this exploration of old-timey Changeling First Edition pre-reckoning fiction, we're starting with The Splendour Falls. Released in summer 1995, this short story collection was one of the earliest Changeling supplements, kind of. It's quite a bit longer than the Anthology of Dreams for C20 that we covered a few episodes ago, containing 22 stories of decent length, for a total of 378 pages in mass-market paperback form. Aaron Kelly was the editor, and the various authors have turned up elsewhere throughout Changeling and the other World of Darkness lines. I'm going to very briefly summarize the stories and try not to spoil too much, and then my overall thoughts at the end. We start with Where There's Smoke by Philip Nutman, wherein a dour issue sitting on a park bench meets a homeless man who tells her the story of an Irish priest who's gifted, maybe accidentally, maybe not, a pet dragon. And as is usually the case with owning a dragon, things quickly get out of his control. It's clearly meant to be horror with the thinnest of Changeling vibes, but some casual racism, abrupt plot shifts, and characters who talk like they know they're in a Poe story all took me out of it a lot. Not very noteworthy. The next one, Birthdays, is by none other than Jackie Casada, and is noteworthy because it shows the chrysalis of Morgan, co-protagonist of the Immortal Eyes saga. And it's actually a pretty solid take on circumstances for a changeling and their family leading up to and during a dream dance. I almost wonder if this was originally intended to be the opening fiction of the first Ed Core book. It was a bit goofy when all the other characters from Immortal Eyes randomly turn up on the scene solely to be named and described and introduce themselves, and then Morgan has a lot of expository dialogue upon her full awakening, but as a prologue to the toy box, I enjoyed the read. Web of Black Metal by Lois Tilton, who wrote a couple other World of Darkness anthology stories, was the first one I really loved in this collection. It's the story of an artist whose boyfriend's behavior is becoming more and more erratic as he spends more time with his band and its mysterious new singer, who seems to be a Leonin Shi on the prowl. But luckily, the protagonist has some help from a mysterious figure from her family's lore. It's not really connected to Changeling as a setting, but hits the vibe really well, especially with showing the Fae's impact on mortals. A Dog's Tale by Nikki Rio was a charming read. Its narrator is a Pooka who falls into the mists while in dog form and inadvertently becomes the pet of an antique shop owner. Upon reawakening, he attempts to revitalize the shop's neighborhood by bringing in new dreamers, and things don't go quite according to plan. He's recounting the story to a third party after what have clearly been disastrous events, and the fact that he's a Pooka adds some color to that storytelling. It does end kind of abruptly, but otherwise fine. So then, A Song Will Rise by Roland J. Green and Frida A. Murphy, two veterans of the Society for Creative Anachronism. I didn't quite get this one. It's dedicated to Canadian folk musician Stan Rogers, who I didn't know about before this story, but who's given an alter ego named Ken Carlisle. This comes up repeatedly in this tale of a boggin who's like, if you made an Excel sheet into a changeling and then made her obsessed with proving, using improv poetry for her soothsay bunks, that this musician she really digs was actually murdered in a Fae conspiracy. I'm going to just spoil this. The conspiracy doesn't actually get resolved or anything, they're just visions and whatnot before, like the last story, this just cuts off in the middle. There's a few interesting takes on using cantrips through computers, but otherwise I was perplexed. Next up is Queen of the Boneyard by Kim Antio. The protagonist is part of a traveling carnival with her mother, with whom she has tension, as she tries and figures out who she is. Her fae nature is stirring awake, and flashbacks show that her Irish grandmother certainly was a fae as well. Take note that domestic violence is a theme in this one, so slight content warning. Overall, I guess you'd kind of call it the meandering story of a chrysalis, but it didn't really grip me the way I expected it would. Chance by Esther M. Friesner is kind of in the same vein, except replace carnival with casino and grandmother with fairy godmother, and make the tone absurdist rather than empowering. The protagonist Rory is a bouncer who secretly dreams of being a chef, so a quirky stranger strikes a bargain with him to make him into one of her dreamers. Best part of this was that the self-appointed godmother toasts at one point to the dream, the dreamer, and the dreaming, totally stealing that from my dinner parties. Otherwise, there are some very florid and or trippy descriptions of chimerical wizardry, and not much else. A Little Something to Believe In is by Ed Gorman and Larry Seagriff, and might be the most overtly "this is the gritty 90s world of darkness" story thus far, being about teenage fae runaway sex workers. One of them seems to have been taken in by a scam about finding Arcadia, another one goes to find her, and there's like a Dauntain Boggin selling other changelings' dreams to a phone hotline. It feels like it's meant to be a specifically changeling kind of creeping horror, but doesn't really know itself or maybe the overall setting enough to make it work. Next is Truth in Advertising by James Lowder, which is a little bit more interesting. It follows the story of Quentin, a gifted advertising worker with an uncanny knack for getting people to spill their secrets to him. He works for a presumably unseelie Slua and Redcap, and it's the rare kind of text that explores the dynamics of ongoing ravaging. It was an interesting yarn, not enough to sustain an entire character or chronicle maybe, but good for a short story. Troll Story by C. Dean Anderson is more or less exactly that. The protagonist Britta is friends with a troll who swore an oath long ago to protect her now dying father. This troll seems to be particularly sensitive to hospitals and banality, which he calls the Black Cloud, some evocative interpretations in this story. There's also a lot of overt Norse and Teutonic stuff in here, and I'm like, can we get off this one note for the kith, please? But anyway, it's a mix of day in the life kind of story and this bittersweet father passing away kind of thing. The grim tale Musings by Matt Forbeck is from the point of view of a famous author telling of how he learned that his muse and lover Shannon was ultimately responsible for his best-selling horror novels. The way musing is presented here is rather different from the game. Shannon does a bunk, and suddenly the protagonist writes non-stop for weeks, and then he's out of ideas for months until she does it another time. I don't love this, but I don't hate it either. What I do hate is the very pat way this story unfolds. It tries to kind of be a Poe story and then doesn't make the cut. There's a hefty dose of misogyny and violence by the end, and I guess it could be an origin story for a villain who hunts fae who he wants to muse him, but meh? Then we have The Gates of Dawn by Rick Hautala, wherein a young woman in the ER, Lisa, recounts to the hospital therapist the events of the night before. She went camping with her clearly fae boyfriend, Arlen, and another fae, Devin, shows up and steals her shadow, because apparently this will get him back to the dreaming. Now Lisa is convinced she's dying, though the therapist remains skeptical. There are some hallucinatory dreams and, spoiler, yet another chrysalis by the end. It's fine, I guess? But after that, Teacher by Gary A. Braunbeck really threw me off. It interlaces the story of a winged Ishu named Pitt, who can sense, manipulate, and imbibe memories with the scientific precision and language of an etherite for some reason, and a homeless man named Curtis being beaten to death by a gang of skinheads, one of whom might be a redcap. Lots of very detailed violence and swearing because it's the 90s and it's World of Darkness, until Pitt shows up like an avenging angel. One interesting bit of the story is the suggestion that the key, or a key, to returning to Arcadia is to learn to comprehend mortal pain, because it's unknown to the fae who dwell in the heart of the dreaming. Otherwise, it's a lengthy and complicated read that we're told is a widely shared tale among Ishu. I can't really imagine why. Wayward Wilder by Lawrence C. Connolly is slightly more fun. Autumn is a 16-year-old runaway who has just arrived at the home of Granny Faye in Greenwich Village. This is essentially one extended chrysalis scene, with Autumn fending off a monstrous chimera as Granny cheers her on. Two good pieces were Autumn reflecting on her childhood of being judged for her synesthesia and ADD before accepting those parts of herself, and Granny subtly manipulating the glamour of the dreamers who live in her building. Beyond that, it's another one of those stories where you try to line the scene up to the systems in the game, and you just can't. There's too much poetic license. Changeling Dirge by Thomas S. Roche has Fauna, a satyr, visit an ex-lover knocker, Eddie Rickenbacker, with the glamour-preserved body of their former third partner, Trish, who has overdosed. Fauna has a broken-down truck that she swears can drive into the Dreaming, and she needs Eddie to fix it so that they can take Trish to be ferried to the afterlife by Charon, per her last wishes. Putting aside how the Dreaming and the underworld don't correspond in the games as they do in traditional lore, it's a decent enough story. It's a bit lurid in the look at the vulgarity and queer sex ways of 90s White Wolf, but meditative and complex enough for the characters to feel more or less like characters, melancholy and bittersweet. Next was Jack of Thieves by Bill Kreider. Something with these stories is that Arcadia is often used interchangeably with the Dreaming, but in this case when Jack, the Changeling Thief protagonist, is, like so many others in this book, trying to get back to the Dreaming, I think it works better if you imagine it set pre-Resurgence. It's kind of hard-boiled and noirish in tone, almost to the point of being comical, but it works. The thing that kept annoying me, though, was that Jack keeps explaining how his powers work, so it's like a narrative version of How to Cast a Wayfair cantrip, up to and including representing the randomized bunk cards as a voice he hears in his head, which just happened to play into his eidetic memory for reciting poetry. Maybe it's supposed to be meta and breaking the fourth wall or something. So, next, I feel that Dreaming Eyes of Wonder by Christopher Kubasik needs some kind of disclaimer. I'll put it this way. It's about an adult changeling fighting against growing old using the dreams of the boy for whom he's an imaginary friend. It very luckily does not get as 90s World of Darkness as it could get, but the optics ain't great, is all I'm saying. Points to the opening 2 lines, though. A coral reef of dishes soaked in the sink that morning. Martha paused, sighed, shook her head pitiably, a sign to some god above that the details were killing her. Martha goes hard as Queen of Drama. Jeremy Dyson's Strawberry Blonde is another story that might need a warning, but it's one of the most skillfully written in the collection, I'd say. A teen named Carl has run away from an abusive stepfather and is living on the streets of London, deathly ill and struggling, surprise, towards his chrysalis. Another runaway named Nicola tries to help him get through it. There's kind of a melodramatic burst near the end, but otherwise the tone is pretty gritty in good ways, with just enough magic to make it uncanny, and the arc of the plot works. Stains on the Ether by Peter Crowther, whose publishing house has won the World Fantasy Award 9 times, I've learned, is interesting but confusing. So let me see if I get this right. A police fae who talks like Joe Pesci chats in a bar with this guy who seems to be a changeling remembering himself, but is actually an elaborate chimera created by, Joe Pesci thinks, the bartender, who is himself actually another chimera created by the actual changeling who has to be slain to release an imprisoned human soul to prevent the dreaming from collapsing or something. The number of tonal shifts, plot twists, and glimpses at alternative interpretations from the early days of the game make it really tough to follow. Good sentence structure, though? Conversely, Sealskin by Kevin Andrew Murphy is a story I needed. It's about surfer teens Rick and Mark Selkirk. Rick inherits a Selkie coat from their great-uncle and somehow transfers its glamour to his wetsuit. Note that Selkies had not yet been introduced in the core game when this was written. Meanwhile, Mark inherits a fortune from their seal great-uncle's lifetime of treasure dives. Both characters appear in the Freeholds and Hidden Glens chapter written by Murphy, set in Santa Cruz, California. So it's a straightforward and sweet backstory for them, and I am always pro-seal folk. Noted horror author Nancy Holder wrote the penultimate story, Dinner in the Hall of Mirrors, wherein a freewheeling French satyr named Jean-Paul and the Dougal-she he adores, Brigitte, attempt to lure an American tourist at Versailles so Brigitte can sleep with him, steal his glamour. It's unclear, but she ends up killing him for some reason. It's rather short and kind of over the top, but I guess shows well how fickle and dangerous even so-called Seelie fae can be. And finally, we end with The Stuff of Life to Knit You by Thomas F. Monteleone and Robert Wayne McCoy. Maybe another warning on this one. It starts in medias res with a beating that turns out to be homophobic, with liberal use of the F slur later. But the crux of the story is 2 changelings, the Fly, formerly of House Liam, and Giselle, the nymph, although she acts more like a she here. It's not bad, showing off traveling through mortal dreams and different subtle permutations of glamour, and it highlights the struggle fae have to not be amoral. The authors keep mentioning the first and last names of every mortal character, which was a choice, and this is one of the few stories that was neither a chrysalis nor all about trying to get back to Arcadia, which I think was a good move for the final entry in the collection. There's a brief lexicon of terms, an ad for the first edition core book, and a mail-in form for other White Wolf fiction, and thus endeth the Splendour Falls. So, the major question with an anthology released nearly at the same time as a core book should be, how much were these authors informed about the setting they were writing into? With C20, there was at least plenty of existing material to draw upon. For this one, I wonder whether they even had a complete draft to work with. There's some stories that seem very much in line with the rules and setting, sometimes too much so, and others that are just kind of vaguely inspired by it. But across the board, there's really not much about the nobility and commoners, nothing about the Accordance War or High King David, or even now that I think about it, the Resurgence. So I wonder how many of those were late additions to the game's metaplot. But the authors must have gotten at least a brief on some of the game concepts, and I imagine it said things to the effect of, all changelings want to get back to Arcadia, Seelie good, Unseelie bad, Chrysalis is the most important moment of a changeling's life, and an apt metaphor for a story collection released in tandem with the launch of the game. Some of the authors are using bunks, up to and including implicit bunk cards being drawn in their heads, while the idea of magic is very fluid for some of the other protagonists. What I am glad of is that the collection is very mortal and autumn world focused, which mitigates the obsessive getting back to Arcadia piece. As we've discussed on the podcast before, one of the virtues of role-playing game tie-in novels and stories is the opportunity to demonstrate what the world feels like as a lived-in world, aligned enough with the game's mechanics that players can see examples of how their characters might act and make choices. A few of the stories in this collection do that, but given that we have 22 of them, maybe not enough. Regardless, I didn't hate it outright, though I was often baffled by some of the authorial choices. Next up on the reading list is The Essential World of Darkness. This omnibus collection of 5 World of Darkness-themed novels, one for each game line, was released in August 1997, so right around the same time as Changeling 2nd. The book presents them without any real fanfare. You just open it up, and there you are in the middle of the vampire novel, which is really more of a graphic novel, as it turns out. The Changeling novel at the end is called Playing with Fire, by the aforementioned Esther M. Friesner from the Splendour Falls. She has been nominated for a number of awards, and at this point had just won the Nebula for Best Short Story 2 years in a row, so she's at the height of her powers. The novel clocks in at 136 pages on fairly large paper with dense text, so it's proper novel length, and the blurb on the back says, "In San Francisco's Chinatown, a Fey youth wrestles with his Chinese and changeling heritage and learns to wield strange powers. Everything's aces, until a friend falls into the clutches of the Unseelie court." This is, not entirely correct, but let's talk about it. The novel follows a protagonist named Tony Lee, who is a teenage runaway / former sex worker now making it on his own in New York City, despite his disturbing dreams. Note, New York City, not San Francisco. He happens across this teen at Port Authority, the main bus terminal in Manhattan, not the kind of place you want to hang around at night, who seems to be not in his right mind, wandering around and only able to communicate through the structure of a knock-knock joke. Therefore, Tony calls him Knock-Knock. Fearing for his safety, Tony takes him home and tries to find somewhere else he can go, but they keep getting accosted by mysterious obstacles, a car that seems to play entrancing music, a rabid hound that appears and then disappears, until a mysterious and abrasive girl named Sylve shows up to claim Knock-Knock as her brother. After being knocked out during an attack by a group of assailants, Tony wakes up in the home of Master Lung, an elderly shopkeeper in Chinatown, who reveals, along with Sylve, that Tony is actually a changeling and helps him through his dream dance. They explained that Knock-Knock was an issue of their community who claimed he found a way to Arcadia, but then the Unseelie did a number on the boy's memory, and now they're trying to restore it because all changelings want to get back to Arcadia, according to them. Tony gets drawn into all of this with much reluctance and occasional butting heads with the often callous changelings of the community. He learns more about his own powers as a Fae and must defend Knock-Knock from those who would seek to end his quest permanently, all against the backdrop of the coming Chinese New Year, and planning with Master Lung a fireworks display to end all fireworks displays. Other characters in the book include Xia Xiao, a sharp-tongued herbalist friend of Master Lung's who has considerable power, Jordan, a comic book shop owner who has been a friend and ally to Tony since he ran away from home, Magloire, the satyr dandy who none of the other changelings dare challenge, and his sister Denny, a mink Pooka who is overdramatic about everything. Tony himself turns out to be a boggin, and Sylva's a knocker, while Master Lung, well, he's something else entirely. In terms of themes, the novel seems to be angling for a found family thing. Tony frequently has flashbacks to a traumatic childhood with a father who passed away when he was quite small, a mother who either broke down or died, it's unclear, and an emotionally abusive grandfather who took him in. By contrast, Syl refers to Knock Knock as her brother, Master Lung as a father figure to the young changelings, etc. One of the troll's side characters has a speech at some point about how many of them don't have families to go back to, and challenges Tony's desire to stay on Earth with mortal ties rather than try to find Arcadia. Beyond that, I suppose self-acceptance could be another theme. Tony struggles with his identity as a changeling at various points, and how to navigate that with the shame and heartache that has defined him so far. Race is also an aspect in here, but I wouldn't call it a theme so much as a thing people keep bringing up, because Tony is half Chinese, Master Lung is Chinese, and the book is dripping with 90s variety racism on lots of the pages. I don't know the author's own background, but it read like this was introduced as simply an angle to create tension and show prejudice in the world of darkness, as well as how changelings overcome it. There are occasional mentions of things from Chinese culture, especially in relation to the New Year celebration. I guess it could have been worse, and at least there's no suggestion that Fae of Chinese heritage are inherently metaphysically different, for this was written well before Land of 8 Million Dreams. But on the subject of the changelingness of the book, this is another one of those cases where it feels like the author either had a cursory overview of the Changeling the Dreaming rules, or they specifically wanted to create their own spin on the world with elements that get outside the standard stuff we get in the books. I would actually prefer the latter. Better if someone intentionally makes choices that are wrong than trying to get it right and falling through the cracks. For example, Tony goes through his dream dance with fairly minimal fuss, but doesn't seem to have changed at all afterwards. Silva at one point mentions that she can't wait to see what Kithy ends up as. He seems to be able to do goofy amounts of illusion magic, yet doesn't have any concrete memories of past lives, just visions of Arcadia lost, or knowledge about changeling life. Fae means sometimes seem to come through in the descriptions, but mostly not. There's no mention of nobility or much social structure, just a nightclub called Chrysalis, where the Fae hang out. Humans learn about changelings without being enchanted, and the mists don't seem to muddy their memories afterwards. It's also one of those early changeling pieces where nobody likes the Slua, the Unseelie are unabashedly evil, all redcaps are unseelie and also noseless, and the return to Arcadia is the defining goal for all Fae. I'm not really into most of these. The book came out in 1997, but maybe only the earliest supplements were available when the authors started drafting. The plotting is also kind of uneven through all this. There are time skips here and there, and sudden developments in the story that characters don't seem to really take time to process. That works in changeling stories that follow a dreamy kind of feel, not so much the ones grounded in gritty 90s streets. I get that it would slow things down, but I wanted to see more scenes where information has to sink in, where characters have a slow and painful learning process about things other than, how do I deal with this really abrasive knocker who keeps getting on my case? I did like the style of the language, for the most part. The description is wild and dreamlike, there's vivid language that creates a good sense of the environment, and even though the dialogue got a little pat or expository at times, notably when they're telling Tony about his nature, conversations unfolded at various points that felt like conversations. The mood of the book does reflect the first edition Changeling vibe to me, a truly ugly and harsh mortal world with changelings in the thick of it bringing light and energy, but it's the kind that's as likely to scorch you as warm you, blind you as easily as illuminate things. Being that it's set in New York, while being totally divorced from canon, there's plenty of media to draw this from. Imagine every film you've seen of a seedy alley on a summer night, then mix in a fireworks display that's as awe-inspiring as it is petrifying, and that's the feel. The contrast between worlds is rarely remarked upon by the changelings in the story themselves. It just kind of comes through in the language choices and the way scenes are set up. It's also a Bildungsroman kind of story, the journey of Tony to accept his nature, accept his new family, and accept himself. I think by the end, he doesn't necessarily feel good about all of it, but it feels right, and that's a mood too. Finally, at the end of the omnibus collection, there's a little blurb about the game that says, "In Changeling the Dreaming, give your inner child free rein, or go unseelie and deal with your inner brat. One blink away from the world of darkness, the kings, courts, knights, and dragons of the Fae still exist, barely, but it's far harder to stay there than they think." I guess that's not entirely a species of untrue, but talk about a limited take on the game. Sheesh. Finally, we come to the collection The Quintessential World of Darkness. Like the Essential World of Darkness, this was an omnibus of 5 novels released in October 1998. Notably, the vampire novel in this case is a Kindred of the East story, as that had just recently been released. For Changeling, we get The Muse by Jodi Lynn Nye, author of The Dragon Lover's Guide to Pern, and apparently the annual science fiction writing workshop instructor at DragonCon. Cool. Less cool is discovering, upon getting to the final section, that the Changeling portion of this book is just a short story. It's only 20 pages, and the font is larger than in the Essential World of Darkness, so there's really not a lot to work with here. The plot follows a Scottish artist named Alan Webster, who encounters a mysterious woman named Calamutina at a bar, and is instantly smitten with her to the point that he invites her to come live with him, strictly platonically. She's very beautiful, he paints her a lot, she does weird things like eat random stuff from the garden. When Alan comes home one night, he finds her fending off an assault by mysterious creatures, and helps fuel her by drawing frantically until the assailants retreat. Since Calamutina has used up her glamour, Alan is now able to see her for what she is, somehow, and she explains that she feels a gateway to Arcadia in the vicinity. Her bizarre acts are bunks for trying to locate it, and she wants Alan's help. They settle on creating a massive portrait of her inside an even more massive sculpted gateway to be publicly revealed on Samhain. The glamour that Calamutina gains from this act will, she thinks, enable her to open that gateway. But the Seelie, mind you, are trying to stop her. I'm not sure if Jody Lynn 9 knew the game at all, because there's basically none of the dreaming-only terminology in this story. It's really more of a general artist helps Fae story that isn't terribly rare in urban fantasy, that has vibes of Charles DeLint to me. Alan's Scottishness and faith, because he keeps mentioning God, stand out more than any distinctive traits of the Muse herself. I suppose she reads as a Leonin because she's worried the Seelie are going to try to stop her, and the arc of building up to one great masterpiece feels like a rhapsody in waiting. I won't spoil how things actually turn out in the end, except to say that it only reinforces my thinking that this wasn't written specifically with the game in mind. As with the Essential World of Darkness novel, there are moments which can't really be put into the context of Changeling's mechanics, or even setting. Like again, Alan doesn't seem to need to be enchanted to understand that his muse is Fae, and the mists don't seem to be a thing at all. I don't think the story is really long enough to have room for themes, and there are a lot of abrupt time skips that threw me as I read. In the span of the first page, Alan goes from seeing Calamutina across the bar, to introducing himself, to inviting her to live with him, and then the first month or so of their association. It read more like an extended fiction piece at the start of a supplement rather than what you'd find in the fiction section of a bookstore. Mood-wise, it also feels a bit spare for its brevity. More time is taken to describe successive actions and their consequences than to really create a feeling of the world. I guess I could see an argument that it unfolds like a dream, rapid changes of scene, unexpected moments of importance, oddity incorporated into the narrative, etc., but it doesn't seem to want to feel that way. The artist-muse relationship is a particular and often problematic thing, and I get the sense this story wants to frame that in bittersweet, unfulfilled romance terms, but without space to address the dynamics of that relationship, that element doesn't really come together for me. The most interesting thing about it is that, in Changeling the Dreaming terms, it shows the full arc of a Fae's influence on a dreamer from the dreamer's point of view. Second most interesting is that Calamutina is clearly unseelie, and yet is not the outright sneering evil that we've often seen in other Changeling stuff of the time. In fact, the Seelie seem to be the snarling beasts and cutthroat rivals, which is an angle that we could use more of in the game. I like some of the descriptive language in the scenes when I'm not feeling that whiplash of sudden transition, but I think this works better as general inspiration rather than an example to a new player of, here's what Changeling is like. So there you have it, some summaries, a few spoilers, and various opinions on Changeling the Dreaming fiction of the 20th century. I'm fairly certain this has covered the rest of that genre which we hadn't gotten to yet. Of course, there's worse fiction out there that conveys a sense of the game, but there's also better, and neither type is strictly necessary. You can listen to our other episodes on Changeling fiction or fiction inspirations, linked in the show notes to this episode for more on those ideas. But generally, I don't mind reading this stuff as an exercise in seeing how other people see the game and how my presentation of it compares as a kind of intertextuality. And it's always nice to have more battered old books on the RPG shelf. So, with that, I will sign off for now. Thanks for your patience, and feel free to get in touch with us on our Discord, our YouTube comments, or any of the other social media platforms also linked in the show notes to this episode. Cheers for now, and until next time, keep on dreaming.